Hey Lake Point, Pastor Mike here to get you caught up on the third week of our series, Peace of Mind. This week, we looked at one of the biggest mental health problems in our culture today, depression. Now, allow me to preface everything I'm about to say with this. Depression is a very complex issue. From everything I've read and experienced, depression is not a one-size-fits-all, but rather it seems to operate along a continuum. On one end of the continuum is discouragement, which we all feel from time to time, and on the other end is total despair. And as far as I understand it, there are essentially four root causes of depression. The first is biological factors, meaning if you're battling with depression right now, you may not have done anything wrong. You might just have a chemical imbalance of some sort in your brain or in your body. There are also social factors. In other words, you might be having a really big problem with one of your kids, and so it's just kind of taking a toll on your mental state. There are also psychological factors, meaning perhaps the root cause of your depression is some kind of trauma that you've experienced. And finally, there's a very real chance that your depression is rooted in some spiritual factors. We have to remember that we do not battle against flesh and blood, but we have very real spiritual battles against the forces of darkness that want to steal, kill, and destroy everything that matters to God. And nothing matters to God more than you do. Now, I'm obviously not a doctor or a licensed counselor. I am a pastor. But I want you to know what I'm talking about today, I'm taking it from a spiritual perspective. While encouraging you, especially if you're leaning towards the total despair end of the depression continuum, to pursue holistic help. Now, what do I mean by holistic help? I mean pursuing any and all avenues of health, such as, talking to a counselor, or you might go to a doctor who might prescribe some helpful medicine, or you might change your diet, or you might start to exercise, or you might start to journal, or you might get into a life group. All wise action steps. So if you're struggling, you need to pursue holistic help, and I encourage you to do so. However, I'm focusing on this topic from one dimension, from a spiritual perspective. And so to help give you a spiritual perspective, I want to read you poetry. Poetry from a man in the Old Testament who was a very depressed man of God. He was a prophet, meaning that he was quite literally someone who spoke on behalf of God. And yet this man of God, this person of deep and committed faith, was also in a very deep and dark and desperate place. And from this deep and dark and desperate place, he composed poetry. And his poems now comprise the book of the Bible we call Lamentations. His name was Jeremiah, and Lamentations contains the 5 poems he wrote about how bad life can be. Now, for context, Jeremiah lived during a time when Israel was being delivered over into exile for their sin. Israel had hardened their hearts to God so many times that God was over it, and so he was kicking them out of the land he had promised to them. Now, during his life, Jeremiah would have witnessed multiple violent deportations of friends and family from his beloved city of Jerusalem all the way to Babylon. He watched as Solomon's temple, the symbol of Israel's faith and the pinnacle of her cultural life, was torn down. What's more, he was one of the few survivors remaining in Jerusalem, and everybody else that was left, they were trying to cope, and so they kept comforting themselves by saying that surely the worst was over. But God told Jeremiah that the worst was actually yet to come, and Jeremiah was given the task of telling everyone that the armies of Babylon would keep coming back until nobody was left. Needless to say, he wasn't very popular. Nobody believed him. They called him a traitor, and so they put him in a dungeon where in Jeremiah chapter 38, verse 6, it says he sunk up to his armpits in mud. It was from this hellhole that Jeremiah composed the poems found in Lamentations. So let's get down into the mud with him and hopefully pull up some wisdom to apply to our own battles with depression. So here we go, Lamentations chapter 3, starting in verse 1. We read, I, Jeremiah, am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again, the whole day long. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. Though I call for help, he shuts out my prayer. You ever feel like that? Like God is not listening? Or have you ever wondered, God, are you the one behind the suffering? At the very least, you are doing nothing to stop it. I know I've been there. Now, here's the thing. Jeremiah knows that this feeling is not true. He'll show us that in a minute. But regardless, he's sharing how he feels. And so he continues in verse 9. He says, He has blocked my ways with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. He's saying, every time I see a way out and I start to make headway, it feels like God just kind of shuts it down. And then he describes God in some not so flattering terms when he says, he is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He turned aside my steps and tore me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. I mean, you ever feel like God is out to get you, almost like he's hunting you? Jeremiah has. He continues in verse 13, he drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. I have become the laughingstock of all peoples, the object of their taunts all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has sated me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind on gravel. He made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. My soul remembers all of this and is depressed within me. It's pretty depressing to read, eh? But it's real, and for some of us, it's real relatable. I mean, I believe it's in your Bible because God wants you to know it's okay to express these emotions to Him. Sometimes we just need a God who hears the grievances of our hearts and walks with us through the pain. I heard Pastor J.D. Greear once say, the greatest Christians in history were not those that were delivered from all pain and misery, but those He delivered through all pain and misery. Now, before we keep looking at Jeremiah's poem, I want to pause for a moment because there's an important truth we need to remember when it comes to depression. And it's this: your emotions are valid, but they're not permanent. When you're hurt, when you don't know what to do or where to turn, when you feel like you've done it all, you can't get out, your emotions, they're valid, they're real, but they're not permanent. Acknowledging them is actually an important part of your healing. Experts say that naming your emotions opens the door to changing your emotions. Your emotions are valid, and so name them. Jeremiah spends 20 verses doing so. And when God saw what Jeremiah wrote down, He deemed it good enough to be included in the scriptures. Friends, it's not more spiritual to pretend like they're not there. They're there. God gave you emotions. They're valid, but they're not permanent. And because our emotions are temporary, and this is very, very important, what I want you to know is that we should not make permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. When you're feeling down, you shouldn't make a permanent decision based on that feeling. And not only should you not make permanent decisions, but you should not come to permanent conclusions. When you feel afraid, when you feel threatened, you might feel like quitting on your marriage, you might feel like quitting on church, you might feel like quitting on God. In the darkest times, you may feel like life is not even worth it. But we must not make permanent decisions or permanent conclusions based on temporary emotions. Your emotions, they're valid, they're real. God gave them to you, and so we're going to feel them, but we're not going to be ruled by them. If you're watching this and in a season of depression, I want you to know that faith and healing start with honesty before God. They start by acknowledging what you're feeling, by naming it, but it doesn't stop there. And so allow me to read to you Lamentations chapter 3, verse 21, because this may be one of the most profound transitions in the Bible. I want you to picture Jeremiah. He's in this dungeon sitting in the mud, and then defiantly he says this, but this I call to mind. In light of everything I just wrote and expressed and felt, he says, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Folks, what I think Jeremiah would want you to know is that your situation may feel hopeless, but with God, there is always hope. You may not feel it, you may not believe it at times, but I want you to know it. In the middle of Jeremiah's darkest moment, he calls to mind the goodness, the character, and the nature of God, and he talks about it. And here's the thing, the phrase call to mind means that this thought is not naturally in there, which in turn means we have to put it in there. It's what D. Martin Lloyd-Jones called preaching to yourself. He said, there is a sense in which the primary task of the scriptures is to teach us how to talk to ourselves. And that's what Jeremiah is doing. He's preaching to himself. Jeremiah, in the depths of his despair, preaches to himself and calls to mind that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. So friends, if your whole world feels dark, I'm inviting you to acknowledge it. Call it what it is. I feel depressed, I feel hopeless, I feel numb. Because the first step to changing your emotions is to actually name them. And then once you name them, I want you to then remind yourself of the hope you have in Jesus. I want you to start preaching to yourself. Just like Jeremiah, I want you to call to mind the faithfulness and goodness of God. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping into discussion questions. I'll see you next time.